I was sweeping the street, feeling the gray dust of London settle on my clothes with each stroke of the broom. My shirt, once clean, had turned into something shapeless and black, as if it had absorbed all the dirt and soot of the city. My clothing was simple. Gray, typical of the poor, who were countless in this city. And at that moment I looked just like one of them, unremarkable, with a broom in my hands. No one noticed me. People walked past, carriages rolled over the cobblestones, and all of it played to my advantage. Today, my goal wasn't as grand as you might imagine. No mysterious murders, no cursed houses or eerie creatures. The Countess of Suffolk had hired me to keep an eye on her husband. My funds had run out after winter, and while no more serious cases appeared, I had to make do with this. After all, the Countess paid well, and the job wasn't difficult. All I had to do was find out where and with whom her husband spent his time. I was assisted by Ethan, a young man who was mastering the art of detective work more and more each day. I glanced at the other side of the street where my partner was sitting. He was poorly dressed, looking like a typical shoe shiner, occasionally earning a few coins. Just now, he had finished with a client when I saw the one we had been waiting for. Our client, a young man with a bold, almost arrogant gait, dressed sharply in a suit that was clearly worth more than I would earn in a month, approached Ethan, tossed him a coin without a word, and placed his foot on the stool for polishing. The whole scene, of course, was just a cover. As soon as his shoes were polished to a shine, our suspect, pleased with himself, moved on. He headed toward the widow's house, who, as it turned out, was a close friend of the Countess. This was his 8th visit, and now there was no doubt. I discreetly pulled out my notebook and jotted down the time, the suspect's appearance, and other details. I think these pieces of evidence would be more than enough for my employer. I felt someone touch my shoulder. A woman standing nearby was saying something about how I had been sweeping the same spot for too long. But I wasn't listening to her. I signaled to Ethan, and gathering our modest belongings, we headed home. Spring in London is a time of transition from icy cold to filthy chaos. The snow had long since melted, leaving behind dirty streams that flowed into puddles and mixed with the soot that covered everything around. The streets, never known for their cleanliness, now resembled an impassable swamp, through which one had to tread carefully, lifting the hem of their clothes to avoid getting them dirty. But it was pointless. Every step turned boots into heavy, muddy clumps. People bustled about, each absorbed in their own affairs. Some hurried with their shopping, others dragged carts of goods behind them. Beggars, like shadows of this city, darted among the passers-by, clutching at sleeves, stretching out their bony hands, begging for just a few coins. Their eyes were full of despair, as if trying to survive in a world that had long turned its back on them. My home was only a few blocks away, but even this short journey through London felt like an eternity. The mud clung to my feet, and the soot from industrial chimneys, mixed with the dampness of spring, settled on anyone who dared venture out onto the streets. I walked beside Ethan, and we both silently endured the path. But soon, something unusual caught our attention. A crowd had gathered at the corner. People stood in a semicircle, glancing at each other and pointing at something in the center. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed through the crowd, smelling the sharp scent of cheap tobacco and sweat. At the center of the spectacle was a young man dressed in wide Eastern pants and a turban, with only a short vest on his bare chest. What struck me most was that his outfit was entirely inappropriate for the cold, not yet warm spring. But upon closer inspection, I realized he was blind. He sat on a stool, playing a flute, and beside him a small monkey in similarly bright clothing danced. The monkey jumped in place, raising its paws as if mocking the gathered crowd. Next to them stood a middle-aged man who was undoubtedly the host of this performance. His bright green coat and red polka dot tie were hard to miss. He loudly called people to gather closer, waving a poster in his hand which depicted a bright tent with freakish people and exotic animals. "Traveling Freak Show" was written in large letters on the poster. Apparently he was advertising the upcoming show. I looked at this scene, pathetic on one hand, strangely mesmerizing on the other, and quickly lost interest. Such spectacles were not uncommon in London. I signaled to Ethan, and we continued our way down the dirty streets without lingering further. Returning home, I felt a sense of relief, as if I had shed a heavy blanket of London's grime and soot. I went to the kitchen, poured warm water into a basin, and removing my clothes, began to wash away the dirt and fatigue of the day. The water quickly turned dark, reminding me of the long hours of work outside. Once I had cleaned myself up, I changed into a fresh shirt and dark trousers. The events of the day involving the Countess and her husband still spun in my head, and I wondered how best to relay the news to my employer. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was an unexpected and somewhat unsettling sound, especially at this late hour. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a slight unease crept into my chest. Quickly throwing on a coat, I approached the door, opened it, and saw a stranger standing before me. He was dressed neither richly nor poorly, an impeccable frock coat, dark gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, studying me. The man removed his hat and bowed. "Good evening," he said quietly, with a slight nod. "My name is Mr. Andrew Clark." His voice was steady, devoid of emotion, which only added to his air of mystery. Mr. Clark continued, "We have a job for you, and I ask that you come with me." The stranger didn't delve into details. I looked at him closely, trying to discern what kind of man stood before me and whether I should trust his words. But there was something in his eyes that told me this man was not one to joke around. After a brief moment of thought, I threw on my coat, grabbed my cane, and followed him. We stepped outside, and it was already getting dark. The air was damp and cool. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, as if foretelling rain. A black carriage, drawn by a pair of horses, stood by the curb, and without a word, we climbed inside. Soon, the wheels began to clatter over the cobblestones, and the carriage jolted forward. As we rode, I gazed at the streets of London through the slightly fogged-up window. The city, as always, was full of activity even at this hour. Pedestrians hurried about their business. Street lamps gradually flickered on, casting long shadows on the dirty walls of buildings. Beggars, despite the approaching night, still roamed among the passers-by in search of a quick coin. The carriage rocked gently, as if tired from the day's journey itself. Soon we turned onto a more secluded street and drove along a tall wrought-iron fence, behind which stood a massive estate. When the carriage stopped, the doors opened, and we were greeted by a butler, an elderly man with neatly combed gray hair and a stern expression. He bowed silently, looking down at me, and gestured for us to follow him. We passed through the massive gates and found ourselves in a well-maintained garden. The path we walked was lined with bushes trimmed to perfect shapes and flower beds with rare spring blooms. The garden was as silent as the people who inhabited this place, creating a strange feeling of isolation. Everything around seemed to breathe wealth and power, but there was a peculiar, almost sinister emptiness in this luxury. Finally, we reached the grand mansion, towering over the garden like a stone giant. As I stepped inside, I was enveloped by the warmth radiating from a fireplace where bright logs were burning. The butler led us through long corridors, the walls adorned with paintings and tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and war. We approached a massive door. The butler knocked 3 times, and a deep voice answered from within. "Enter." When I walked into the study, the first thing that caught my eye was a large chair by the fireplace, in which a man was seated. He appeared to be in his 40s, but looked much older. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if all the life had been drained from him. Dark circles under his eyes gave the impression that he hadn't slept for an eternity, and his hunched shoulders, burdened by an unseen weight, only reinforced that feeling. His face was gaunt, as if all his energy had been squeezed out, and his eyes held a hollow emptiness, devoid of their former spark. I recognized him immediately. Richard Abbott, a well-known politician whose name had been on everyone's lips in recent years. Abbott had risen quickly through the political ranks, and was currently the right-hand man of the Prime Minister himself. Many believed that he was destined for great political success, and some even speculated that he would one day lead the country. Not long ago, he had been full of energy at public appearances, his voice commanding, every gesture exuding power and determination. But the man sitting before me was a mere shadow of his former self. The butler gestured for me to sit in the chair across from him. I sank into the soft seat, not taking my eyes off Abbott, who slowly raised his head. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but the strength had clearly left him. It seemed as though even uttering a single word would drain whatever life he had left. At that moment, Mr. Clark, the same man who had brought me here, spoke on his behalf. "Mr. Abbott wishes to request your assistance. It's difficult to explain exactly what has happened, but trust me, the matter requires your involvement." His voice was as calm as before, but there was something more in his words. Not just a request, but almost a demand. I simply nodded, signaling for him to continue. He didn't hesitate. "The truth is, something strange and, to be honest, mystical has happened to Mr. Abbott. It's hard to believe, and even now I'm struggling to grasp the reality of it. But as you can see, his condition speaks for itself. Mr. Abbott cannot lie," Clark said with absolute seriousness. I scratched my head, inwardly smirking. What kind of nonsense is this? A politician who can't lie? But Mr. Clark wasn't smiling, nor did he seem to be joking. That's when I realized that apparently he was telling the truth. I pulled out a notebook from my pocket and held it up to Abbott. "You see this notebook, don't you? But can you tell me it's a meat pie?" The politician raised his head, opened his mouth, and after a few seconds tried to speak, but only unintelligible sounds came out. After a moment, with visible effort, he cursed and admitted that he couldn't do it. "Well then," I muttered, realizing that this situation was far stranger than I had initially thought. "Tell me in detail what happened." This time, Abbott himself spoke. His voice was hoarse, as if each word took a great effort. "It happened 2 days ago," he began, leaning back in his chair. "I had just returned from a debate. I was exhausted, entered my room, and suddenly felt that someone was there. When I turned around, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was a beastly growl. I lost consciousness." He paused, trying to collect his thoughts. "When I woke up, the butler found me. At first I thought nothing had changed, but soon I realized that one thing was missing: my talisman. A coin I had bought at an auction. They said it was brought from South America and it cost a small fortune. I wore it as a good luck charm, and now it was gone. Only that. And then, I realized I couldn't lie anymore. I stared at him in confusion. Abbott continued, sighing wearily. Do you understand what this means for a politician of my stature? It's the end. At the opening of an orphanage, I almost began speaking the truth. It could have destroyed my career. I barely managed to leave without saying something incriminating. So you not only can't lie, but you involuntarily speak the truth? I clarified. Abbott silently nodded, and I couldn't help but smile. A politician who can't lie. It sounded like something out of a fantasy. But this situation was very real. What kind of coin is this? And why is it so important? How is it connected to what happened? I asked several questions, trying to piece everything together. There were few answers, but my interest was piqued. I continued to ask more questions, gathering as much information as I could, then requested to be shown the room where the incident took place. We headed to the very room. It was an ordinary enough space. A desk, shelves with books, a chair by the fireplace. At first glance, everything seemed to be in its place, as if no one had entered. But I was always attentive to details. As I scanned the room, my gaze suddenly stopped on a strange mark on the floor. It wasn't the print of a boot or shoe. It was the print of a hoof. What the hell? I muttered. What was an animal doing here? I made a note in my notebook, noting the oddity of the situation. The window in the room was slightly ajar. It seemed someone had entered through it, but for what purpose? I inspected everything as thoroughly as possible, but unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to draw definitive conclusions. I took all the statements and told Abbott and Clark, "There's not enough evidence yet, but I'll begin working on this case." After that, I bid them farewell, and they escorted me back to the carriage. Soon, we were riding once again through the dim streets of London until the carriage stopped at my home. The night after my meeting with Mr. Abbott was restless. I tossed and turned in bed, mentally going over the details of the case. Once again, something mystical, something beyond the ordinary. This world, which seems so clear to most people, is actually full of mysteries and enigmas. I knew that firsthand. I'd encountered beings and events before that by all accounts of logic should not exist. Yet they did. And now, a man who cannot lie. A stolen coin. What did it mean? Why was it taken? The questions buzzed in my head like bees in a hive, and with each passing minute there were more and more of them. The next day I went to see the Countess to deliver all the information I had gathered. It was clear that she was furious when she heard the news, but I wasn't concerned. My job was to complete the investigation, and she was just a client. The important thing was that I had earned my pay. With a full purse, I headed home, looking forward to finally relaxing. However, I found a new guest waiting by my front door. It was a young woman, dressed like someone from the middle class. In a modest yet neat dress, she looked like a school teacher, or perhaps a governess. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her face pale but determined. "Good afternoon," she said, giving a slight bow as I approached. "Are you Detective Hargrave?" I nodded, looking at her with curiosity. "What do you need?" "My name is Margaret Vincent," she introduced herself. "I have a matter I'd like to discuss with you." I invited her inside, but she politely declined, explaining, "I'm sorry, but it's urgent. Would you be able to come with me?" I agreed, and soon we were sitting in a carriage. She took me across the city, and I watched as the dirty, crowded streets of London gradually gave way to cleaner, more well-kept neighborhoods. We entered an area where the middle class lived. Here the houses stood neatly in a row, and the roads, while not perfect, were much cleaner. Finally, the carriage stopped in front of one of the 3-story houses. We got out and climbed a narrow staircase to the top. Margaret stopped in front of one of the doors and, turning to me, began to explain. "You see, my brother is a well-known artist, but recently something terrible happened to him. He went blind. It's a tragedy, for how can an artist continue to paint if he cannot see? We've consulted many doctors, but none could help. They simply shrugged." "How did it happen?" I asked. "One night," she continued, lowering her gaze, "my brother heard a strange sound outside the window. We live on the 3rd floor. And it was surprising to him that someone could be out there. There's no balcony, no ledge. He got up to see who it was, and as soon as he opened the window, something threw him back into the room. He heard a melody that seemed to paralyze him, lulling him to sleep. When he woke, he realized he could no longer see." I listened to her story and then asked the obvious question, "But why did you come to me?" "I'm not a doctor." "My friend said you've dealt with otherworldly phenomena before," Margaret replied. "And my brother, in his desperation, turned to so-called spiritualists. They are performing a ritual now, and I want you to investigate it." She opened the door, and we stepped into a small apartment. We walked down a short corridor decorated with several paintings, and turned into one of the rooms. There I saw a strange scene. In the center of the room, around a round table, sat 4 people. A young man, presumably Margaret's brother, held the hands of the others, staring straight at a crystal ball in the center of the table. Or rather, it seemed like he was staring, as his eyes were covered with a white film instead of pupils, which looked eerie. Along with him were 2 women and an older man dressed in a hooded cloak. They all appeared to be in a trance, absorbed in the proceedings. The woman sitting in the center was whispering loudly, as if reciting an ancient ritual. Her whisper resembled the hissing of a snake, and it made me uneasy. Margaret and I stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. The ball emitted a dim, strange light, and it felt as if time had stopped in the room. Suddenly the woman began to wheeze, her voice becoming strange and unnatural. She howled as though sounds from deep within her soul were escaping, sounds that didn't belong to this world. Then she spoke, her voice trembling and foreign. "He is here. He wants to break free, and is gathering the keys." After these words, she let out a piercing scream, her hands breaking free from the other's grip, and she collapsed to the floor, convulsing. Everyone jumped up in shock and confusion, except for the young man, Margaret's brother. He remained seated, unaware of what was happening. The woman soon calmed down, her breathing steadying. But when she opened her eyes, they were filled with pure fear. "I need to leave. Immediately," she whispered softly, and without paying attention to anyone else in the room, she hurriedly stood up. Her companions, also without a word, followed her. They left the room in silence, not even glancing in my direction. The 3 of us remained: Margaret, her brother Tom, and myself. Tom turned his head, utterly confused. "Margaret, are you here? What's happening?" he asked, trying to understand why everyone had suddenly fled. "Tom, they're gone," she replied quickly. "I told you they were frauds, but I've brought someone who can help. This is Detective Hargrave. He's dealt with similar cases before, and I'm confident he'll handle this." Tom simply nodded wearily, not moving from his seat. He seemed completely drained. I sat down beside him and began asking questions. "Did you hear or see anything unusual before this happened? And did anything go missing?" The young man looked surprised. "How did you know?" "Yes, something did go missing. A coin I kept." This time, I was the one surprised. Another story involving a coin. It couldn't be a simple coincidence. "Go on," I urged him. Tom sighed and began to explain. "I've already told Margaret. But just before I was thrown back, I saw something strange outside the window. It was a monkey. A macaque. His voice trembled, but he spoke with complete seriousness. His words instantly reminded me of the street performance I had seen earlier, with the musician and his dancing monkey. Could it be connected somehow? "Can you tell me more about the coin?" I asked, still trying to piece the puzzle together. "Do you think it's related to what happened to you?" Tom paused for a moment before answering. "I don't know why, but I feel like it is. I bought it at an auction, just as an investment. I thought I'd sell it for a higher price later. But shortly after I acquired it, strange things started happening. I had more inspiration, my painting improved significantly, and my works began to sell one after the other. I felt like that coin somehow gave me strength." He gave a bitter smile. "This sounds crazy, but when I woke up after that night, I realized the coin was gone, and with it my abilities disappeared. I can't paint anymore. Not just because I'm blind, but I can't even picture anything in my head, not even the simplest of images. It's like everything that made me an artist was taken away. This isn't some illness. I'm sure it's connected to something supernatural." I listened to his story carefully, asking follow-up questions, and then I requested to see his room. The room was simple. A bed stood in the center, a few paintings hung on the walls, and a desk near the window was cluttered with papers and brushes. I looked around but didn't notice any obvious signs of something or someone else being there. Everything seemed surprisingly ordinary. I walked to the window, opened it, and looked down. The third floor, no balcony, no ledge to hold on to. Climbing up here would be extremely difficult, but still possible. I closed the window and scanned the room again, but found nothing suspicious. My head was full of questions. Another missing coin. Another supernatural incident. This case was becoming more and more tangled. "This is a very strange case," I said, addressing Tom and Margaret. "But I'll start working on it. Something's definitely wrong here." After saying my goodbyes, I left the apartment. The carriage took me home, and along the way I couldn't shake the feeling that all these events were connected somehow. When I returned home, I half expected another visitor, or at least a strange guest like the night before. But the house was empty. No one came that evening or the next day. Meanwhile, I kept pondering this confusing case, gathering clues in my mind and trying to piece them together. First, I sent Ethan to track down the auctioneer who had sold the mysterious coins to both Mr. Abbott and Tom. Maybe we'd find the leads we needed there. As for me, I decided to follow another clue, the monkey. That strange detail wouldn't leave me alone. The only place that came to mind was the circus where I had seen the macaque. It couldn't be a coincidence that this animal was present in both cases. The next day, I found a poster for the freak show and discovered where they were performing. It was in one of the city's squares, where street performances often took place. It wasn't hard to get there, but when I arrived, I was struck by the sight. In the center of the square stood a huge tent, surrounded by a temporary fence. The tent was brightly painted with red and yellow stripes that looked absurdly out of place against the gray, soot-covered backdrop of London. Children ran around the fence, eagerly guessing what was happening inside. The tent was closed until the evening, so I stayed to observe the area. The square was lively. Vendors sold sweets and hot drinks at every corner, street traders shouted about their goods, and curious onlookers peeked through gaps in the fence. I knew the show would start later, closer to dusk, so I decided to scout the surroundings, studying whether anything was hidden behind the facade of this colorful circus. As dusk approached, people began to gather in the square. The crowd quickly grew, and soon a long line formed, eager to get inside the tent. I joined the line, watching the faces of the people around me. Each of them was absorbed in anticipation of the show, children tugging on their parents' sleeves, and street musicians tried to create a festive atmosphere. My turn came, and I found myself at a small wooden booth where an elderly woman sat as the cashier. She wore round glasses, her face sullen and displeased, as if she hated her job. Her wrinkled face with tightly pressed lips and plump cheeks reminded me of a toad. "3 pence," she muttered, not looking at me, stretching out a gnarled hand. I paid and received a ticket, then made my way toward the tent. The man in the green coat, whom I had seen earlier, was standing at the entrance. He cheerfully took my ticket, and as if on cue said, "Welcome, welcome. We are in for wonders and mysteries. Please, make yourself comfortable." I nodded to him and entered the tent. Inside, it was set up simply but with a certain flair for showmanship. In the center was a sandy arena, surrounded by benches arranged in a semicircle for the audience. The benches were tiered, so everyone could see what was happening in the arena. The floor of the tent was covered in soft sand, and its walls were painted in bright colors that only added to the sense of surrealism. In the center of the arena stood a few wooden crates, clearly ready for future performances, and some basic equipment for the show. I took a seat on one of the benches, trying not to draw attention to myself, and continued to watch as people settled in. Soon, a tall man walked into the arena, immediately drawing the crowd's attention. His height was striking, nearly 2 meters, his broad shoulders emphasizing his imposing figure. He was dressed in an elegant black suit that fit him perfectly, giving the impression that he was more of an aristocrat than a circus master. His long dark hair was tied into a bun at the back of his head, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his sharp chin. But perhaps the most noticeable feature of his face was his enormous hawk-like nose, giving him a fierce, almost predatory appearance. The man gracefully bowed before the audience, spreading his arms wide, and introduced himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sylvester Grimo. I am the master of this humble establishment, and I am pleased to welcome you to our little corner of wonders and mysteries. Prepare yourselves, for today you shall witness the incredible." His voice was deep and echoed through the tent like the tolling of a great bell. He held a pause as the audience fell silent in anticipation. Then, with a flourish of his hand toward the arena, announced the beginning of the show. The first performer to enter was a massive, incredibly obese man. His size was shocking. He barely fit through the entrance of the tent. Dressed in a simple shirt and trousers, his enormous belly and massive limbs seemed beyond his control. Every step was a visible effort. He could barely move, but with each passing moment, the crowd became more and more amazed by his sheer existence. Despite his bulk, the man displayed his strength, lifting massive weights that seemed impossible for a normal person. He grabbed a hefty iron bar and, straining his powerful arms, bent it in half, prompting loud gasps of disbelief from the crowd. People applauded, unable to believe what they were seeing. Next to take the stage was a bearded woman. Her thick, dark beard cascaded down her chest, creating a strange contrast with her otherwise feminine figure. But her beard wasn't her most remarkable feature. Instead of 2 arms, she had 4, like some ancient Indian deity. All 4 limbs moved with astonishing coordination as she performed intricate acrobatic tricks. Furthermore, she had a hunchback, which only added to her unusual appearance. She skillfully juggled knives with both hands, while simultaneously balancing spinning plates on her head, leaving the audience utterly mesmerized by her dexterity. One after another, various people and animals stepped onto the stage, each time surprising the audience. A tall man with gigantic legs, a snake woman with flexibility that seemed unreal for the human body, and even exotic animals such as lions and tigers, which trainers made perform dangerous tricks. Among the performances was that very macaque, dancing to the music, which made me uneasy. It seemed like a regular circus performance, albeit with elements of strangeness and mysticism, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. All this eccentricity might have been just a cover for something darker, hidden beneath the surface. I watched everything closely, trying to catch the slightest hint of a clue. When the show ended, I learned that the circus would stay in town for another 5 days. This gave me some time to unravel the mystery. As I headed home, I pondered over all the details, but as soon as I opened the door, I saw Ethan eagerly waiting for me. He looked excited, and as it turned out, he had good news. "I found the auctioneer," he said, then mentioned the name. Surprisingly, I knew the man. Digging through my memory, I recalled that I had once helped him with a case, which could work to my advantage. The next day, we went to see him. He lived in a small yet well-kept mansion on the edge of town. The house was 2 stories tall, with white walls and a neat gray slate roof. Surrounding the mansion was a garden, enclosed by a low iron fence, behind which were trimmed bushes and blooming flower beds. Everything looked as though the homeowner was a meticulous and pedantic man. We approached the door and knocked. After a few moments, the door opened, and a short man with neatly trimmed mustaches and expressive brown eyes stood before us. His hair was slightly graying, but he appeared lively and energetic. The man smiled as soon as he saw me, recognizing me. "Ah, Detective Hargrave, what brings you here?" he exclaimed, extending his hand. "It's been a while." "Good to see you, Mr. Hawthorne," I replied, shaking his hand. We exchanged pleasantries, and Mr. Hawthorne, still smiling, invited us inside. He led us to the living room, a spacious room with tall windows overlooking the garden. The room was cozily furnished, with soft chairs, bookshelves, and a large table covered with an elegant tablecloth. On the table, there was already a tray with a porcelain teapot and several cups. "Please, have a seat," Hawthorne offered, pouring us some tea. "So, what brings you to me?" We sat down, and I began telling him about the strange coins. "Mr. Hawthorne," I began, "I've recently come across a case involving some ancient coins. Could you tell me what you know about them and who you sold them to?" Mr. Hawthorne furrowed his brow, thinking. "Yes, I remember that lot," he said, setting his cup aside. He stood up and left the room, returning a few minutes later with a large notebook in hand. "I usually don't disclose information about my buyers, but for you, my friend, I'll make an exception." He started flipping through the pages, muttering to himself until he found the right place. "Here it is," he said, stopping at the page. "These coins were found in South America, specifically in present-day Bolivia. Archaeologists discovered them in the ruins of an ancient city believed to belong to the mysterious Yataka tribe. This tribe existed long before the Incas and, according to legends, worshipped ancient spirits dwelling deep within the earth. Archaeologists found several burial sites of priests, and in their tombs lay these very coins. They were made from an unusual metal and covered in strange symbols that no one has been able to decipher to this day." Hawthorne turned the page and continued. "The coins were smuggled into England in the mid-20th century. They remained in private collections for a long time until they were eventually put up for auction. I sold them a few years ago. There were 6 coins in total, but 2 were stolen before I had the chance to sell them. As for the remaining 4, I can tell you who their owners are." He paused, then continued. "The first owner is Mr. Richard Abbott, a politician whose name I assume is already familiar to you. The second is Tom Vincent, an artist. The third is the famous opera singer Harold Flynn, whose name resonates in high society. His voice was a true marvel, and many believed he could hit notes that other singers wouldn't even attempt. His career skyrocketed to incredible heights after he acquired this coin. And finally, the fourth owner is Marcus Reed, a wealthy merchant who made his fortune in international trade. He collected rare items from around the world and was known for his fascination with artifacts with mystical histories. Meister Hawthorne fell silent and looked at me seriously. Unfortunately, I have no information about the two stolen coins. They might have ended up in private collections, or their trail has simply been lost. This was valuable information, and I couldn't waste any time. I immediately asked, "Do you know where the other two coin owners live?" Mr. Hawthorne nodded and wrote down the addresses on a piece of paper. We thanked him and headed to the nearest one, opera singer Harold Flynn's home. I didn't know if we would catch him at home, but it was essential to check. When we arrived, we were met with an unusual sight. A group of constables was gathered in front of the house discussing something among themselves. Nearby stood a young woman, beautiful, with long blonde hair and dressed elegantly. She was explaining something to them but looked noticeably worried. A man around 40, tall and stately, with sharp features and slicked-back black hair, stood nearby. This was Harold Flynn himself, but his appearance sharply contrasted with his current condition. He couldn't speak and was gesturing to explain something with his hands. Seeing this, I realized we were too late. Someone had already broken in and stolen the coin. As I approached, one of the constables recognized me. I explained the situation, and after a brief discussion, I was allowed to speak with the singer and examine the crime scene. I approached Harold and his wife, who turned out to be the same woman explaining the situation to the constables. I introduced myself and briefly shared some of my past investigations to assure them that I could be trusted. Then I asked them to tell me what had happened. Harold took a piece of paper, as it was difficult for him to speak. His wife helped translate his gestures into words as he nodded and added details with his hands. "I was resting in the garden," his wife began, interpreting his gestures. Suddenly, a strange fog appeared. It rose quickly, seemingly out of nowhere. And in that fog, someone attacked Harold. He lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he realized the coin, which he always carried with him, had been stolen. I asked Harold how important the coin was to him. He hesitated but eventually revealed his secret. "It was an incredibly valuable object to me," he rasped, placing a hand on his throat. "Ever since I received it, my voice grew stronger. It was as if it gave me power." Now his voice sounded hoarse and barely audible. I had to lean in to catch every word. Everything started to piece together. These coins seemed to grant their owners some kind of strength, and someone, having learned of this, was deliberately stealing them, stripping people of their gifts. In Harold's case, it was his magnificent voice. The picture was unsettling. After asking some questions, I began examining the crime scene. To my surprise, there were tracks on the ground, but they weren't human or hoof prints like last time. These were the prints of a large predatory animal, possibly a wolf. Memories of an old case surfaced, where I had encountered a wolf-like monster. It had been a terrifying encounter, and I shuddered involuntarily, knowing I might face something similar again. As I followed the trail, I realized the tracks led to the garden wall. Whoever attacked Harold had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. However, this gave me a new lead. We didn't waste any time and headed to the last owner, Marcus Reed, a wealthy merchant. His home was in an elite neighborhood, where the streets were paved with clean stone, and the houses loomed like stone fortresses. It was a district where the wealthiest people in the city lived. Tall gates, manicured gardens, and grand mansions with columns created an atmosphere of luxury and power. Marcus's home was one of those. A massive building with a columned facade and a towering iron fence, shielding it from prying eyes. We knocked on the massive oak door, and moments later it was opened by a butler. His gaze was full of disdain, as if our presence was an unpleasant trifle not worthy of attention. Dressed in an impeccably pressed black suit, with perfectly combed gray hair, he gave us a once-over. "How may I assist you?" he said coldly, barely raising an eyebrow. I explained why we were here and who we wanted to see. He snorted with displeasure, but realizing the seriousness of our visit, he said he would pass the message. A few minutes later, the butler returned, his demeanor now changed, replacing disdain with nervous respect. "Please, gentlemen, come in," he said with a bow. "Follow me." We followed him through long hallways adorned with portraits and antique items. Soon he led us into a spacious study, where a man in his 60s sat by the fireplace. He looked authoritative, with the bearing of someone used to command and make decisions. His face, with its sharp, stern features and thick eyebrows, now slightly graying, exuded calm confidence. This was Marcus Reed, the last owner of the coin. "Please sit," he invited, gesturing to the chairs. "And tell me what brings you here." I didn't hold anything back and detailed everything. The series of attacks, the stolen coins, and the strange events happening to their owners. Marcus listened attentively, never interrupting once, and when I finished, he slowly nodded. "Yes, you're right," he said quietly. "I still have the last coin, and I always keep it on me." I looked at him intently. "Could you hide it somewhere safe?" I suggested, knowing the coin could make him the next target. But Marcus shook his head firmly. "I will never part with it," he said with such conviction that arguing would have been pointless. These coins were undoubtedly more than just valuable artifacts. They clearly granted their owners some kind of power or ability, and Marcus was no exception. I thought for a moment before telling him that an attack was likely inevitable, and that he needed to be prepared. "What can you do for your protection?" I asked. Marcus thought for a moment. "I can hire guards," he said. "But to be honest, I doubt they'll be able to handle what you've described." I agreed. The creatures attacking the coin owners clearly had supernatural abilities, and ordinary people might be powerless against them. Suddenly, an idea came to mind, and I shared it with Marcus. He listened carefully, pondering for a while, then nodded. "Yes, that might work. The key is to be prepared in time." He summoned the butler and gave him instructions. We stayed in his mansion, where he provided us with rooms. Marcus also hired guards who patrolled the property, but for several days, nothing happened. The last day, just before the circus was set to leave town, I had a feeling that something was about to happen. It did that evening. We heard a loud crash. One of the windows on the second floor had been shattered. The guards rushed upstairs while I stayed back, deciding to look around. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a mist starting to settle. It rose quickly and suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, enveloping everything around. A sudden fear gripped me. There was something sinister in this fog. I listened carefully and suddenly heard strange, hissing sounds in the distance. Then, a growl, low and deep, as if it came from the depths of the earth. I took a step forward, trying to see something through the mist, when out of nowhere, something hit me with immense force in the chest. I flew back, crashing into the wall. The creature that flew past me was just a blur, and I barely caught sight of its massive shadow. Struggling to my feet, I ran after it, but then gunshots rang out. Bursting into the room, I saw that the fog still lingered in the air, and on the floor lay Marcus, unconscious. His coin, which always hung around his neck, was gone. The guards stood nearby, but they were helpless. The creature had been too fast. I scanned the room and suddenly saw a sharp movement in the corner. Raising my revolver, I fired. The bullet grazed the creature, and it roared in pain. It was a werewolf, but not like the one I had encountered before. Its fur was silver, as if reflecting light, and its appearance was both menacing and strangely beautiful. It leapt towards the window and jumped outside, leaving behind traces of silver blood on the floor. I realized what we were dealing with. A werewolf, but not an ordinary one. The silver fur meant it was a rare, almost mythical being. I rushed over to Marcus and brought him back to consciousness. Ethan and the guards returned to the room, but the coin had already been stolen. I knew time was not on our side, and we had to act quickly. After saying goodbye to the merchant, we headed to the circus. I was certain that everything that had been happening was connected to them. Their last day in town had drawn a large crowd. The square was packed, and the show was completely sold out. We barely managed to buy tickets and made our way inside. The performance was nearly identical to what I had seen before, but at one point, a girl took the stage. She was incredibly beautiful, with long dark hair and striking eyes. However, it wasn't just her beauty that caught my attention. She moved with an unusual grace, an almost superhuman agility. Her movements were quick yet fluid, like a predatory cat preparing to pounce. Her acrobatic tricks were unlike anything I had ever seen before. She soared above the stage with breathtaking ease, performing flips and pirouettes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But most importantly, she wore a bandage on her arm, right where I had shot the werewolf. My heart skipped a beat, then started pounding in my chest. All of my suspicions were confirmed. This girl was the very creature that had attacked Marcus. I knew we were in the right place. We waited for the performance to end, doing our best not to draw attention. When the audience began to disperse, we quietly hid under a staircase leading backstage. I held my breath when I saw the same man in the green jacket, the circus master, looking around. He walked to the tent entrance and pulled the curtain shut, sealing the exit. Now we were trapped inside. We waited for about an hour. My legs started to ache from being in such an uncomfortable position for so long, and I tried to rub them to prevent them from going numb. By then, night had fallen outside, and an eerie silence filled the tent. Suddenly I heard some noise. One of the circus workers was bringing a massive table into the center of the arena. The table was ancient, with engraved symbols covering its surface. Other circus members, acrobats, performers, and animal trainers began to appear, placing candles in a circle around the arena. Their dim, flickering light cast strange shadows, creating a gloomy, ominous atmosphere. Soon I heard a faint, rhythmic drumming, low and hypnotic, intensifying the feeling that something dark was about to happen. Ethan, sitting beside me, looked nervous. I patted his shoulder, trying to reassure him. "It'll be okay," I whispered. He nodded, but the tension in his face didn't ease, and his hands continued to nervously fidget with the hem of his jacket. We continued watching the preparations, and I began to understand. This wasn't just a circus. They were getting ready for some kind of ritual. When everything was set, the circus master, Sylvester Grimo, stepped into the center of the arena. His arrogant gaze swept over the gathering. He looked truly sinister, like a demonologist presiding over a dark, magical ceremony. Around him, the rest of the circus staff began to assemble. There were about 20 of them, each kneeling before Sylvester as if worshipping their master. Ethan and I remained frozen, watching this scene unfold. A growing sense of dread gripped me, and the air felt thick with danger. It was as if the ritual had already begun. Standing at the center of the arena, Sylvester Grimo gave a command to his followers. One of them placed an old cast-iron cauldron on the table, and a small flame was lit beneath it. Soon, a strange smell filled the air as a dark liquid inside the cauldron began to bubble, sending up thick plumes of steam. Everyone remained on their knees, seemingly entranced, their eyes fixed on the eerie process. As the liquid boiled, Sylvester suddenly began to emit strange sounds, sounds that seemed inhuman. His voice grew deep and hollow, as though a demon from the underworld was speaking through him. It was something that made my skin crawl, and the hairs on my body stand on end. These sounds didn't belong in the human world. The other participants knelt with their heads bowed, as if worshipping their master, listening intently. Then something even more horrifying happened. Sylvester began to call out names one by one. Each name sounded like a sentence, and after each, 6 of the participants began to rise. The first to stand was the blind musician I had seen with the monkey. At that moment, his monkey, which had been sitting beside him, began to transform. Its body grew larger. Its skin turned a dark, menacing green, and its paws morphed into powerful claws. Its eyes glowed yellow, and the musician himself suddenly opened his eyes, which he hadn't had before. He was no longer blind. His pupils gleamed with a demonic light, and a predatory expression crossed his face. The monkey, now a massive beast, began to snarl, baring its teeth. The girl I had seen earlier, the one with the acrobatic skills and the bandage on her arm, also began to change. She let out a piercing scream as her body stretched and twisted. Her skin paled to an unnatural silvery shade, and her arms elongated, sprouting fur while her claws grew to terrifying lengths. She had transformed into a werewolf, with the same silver fur I had seen before at Marcus's estate. Her form was eerily graceful, yet undeniably deadly. Next to rise was a man with a gaunt face and long hair. His body began to contort and shake until his bones cracked and reshaped themselves. His skin took on a sickly gray-green hue, and his arms transformed into long, slimy tentacles, as though he had emerged from the depths of the sea. His eyes flared with malice as he hissed, glaring at the others. 2 others transformed almost simultaneously. One, a thin and sinewy man, let out a scream as his body suddenly swelled in size, his muscles bulging, turning him into a monstrous giant with rough, brown-spotted skin. His hands became enormous, like hammers, and he slammed them into the ground, causing it to tremble. The last one, a quiet, unremarkable man with a face like a mime, suddenly hissed as his body shrank and flattened into something spider-like. His limbs turned into long, black, hairy legs, and he scurried up the side of the tent, watching the proceedings from above. Ethan and I watched in mixed horror and fascination, our minds swirling with fear, dread, and a strange, painful curiosity. This was a ritual that was clearly beyond our understanding. But one thing was certain: we shouldn't have been there. Each of these creatures seemed like a nightmare made real. Suddenly, the werewolf girl, the one I had faced before, lifted her head sharply, as if catching a scent. Her keen sense of smell had likely detected us. My heart raced. We were in danger. I was about to bolt from our hiding spot, but I didn't have time. The werewolf girl leaped across the entire arena with incredible speed, landing right in front of us. Her face was twisted with rage and malice, her eyes blazing. She struck me with such force that I almost lost consciousness. The air knocked from my lungs. Pain shot through my body as I crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. The other monsters quickly joined her, the giant and the spider-like creature. They grabbed us and tied us tightly, dragging us to the center of the arena. The circus master, Sylvester Grimo, stood in the center, his eyes glowing an unnatural red. He was no mere man. Before me stood a demon, trapped in human form. His gaze pierced straight into my soul. "I see we have uninvited guests," he said with a mocking tone. "I knew about you, Detective Hargrave. Knew you were following this case. But I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to show up here tonight. I thought you were smart enough to understand that it's not wise to cross us. It seems I was wrong." He laughed, and his laugh echoed throughout the tent, sending chills down my spine. "Well, since you're here, stay and witness the arrival of my master, who has been imprisoned for centuries. At last he will be free and will rid this world of pitiful humans like you." I didn't understand what he meant. My attention was drawn to Ethan's figure. He was unconscious next to me, and my sense of dread only deepened. I thought this might be the end. I felt for my gun. It was still tucked in my coat, but I was tightly bound and unable to use it. We were left lying on the ground as the ritual continued. I suspected they planned to deal with us after it was complete. Sylvester Grimo spoke again, his voice like a dark incantation, and with each word the air grew heavier with something dark, something unimaginable. He then began to call out names one by one. One by one, the monsters on the stage rose and approached the cauldron of boiling liquid. Each of them held a coin, the very ones that had been stolen. I realized that each of them possessed one of those ancient coins. The first to approach was the spider-like man. His movements were quick and predatory as he dropped his coin into the bubbling liquid. As the coin touched the surface, a loud hissing sound filled the air, like metal melting from the heat. A strange figure began to form above the cauldron, a skull made of steam and smoke. One after another, the other monsters repeated the process. The giant man tossed in his coin, his face stern and emotionless. Then the man with the tentacles dropped his coin, and it, too, produced a loud hiss, lifting another fragment of that terrifying skull from the steam. With each coin thrown into the cauldron, the ritual moved closer to its climax. Finally, Grimo called the name of the werewolf girl. She approached the cauldron with the coin in her hand, her silver fur gleaming in the candlelight. Time seemed to stop. The werewolf girl slowly opened her hand, revealing the coin, and with a flick of her wrist she dropped it into the cauldron. At that moment I saw the expression on Sylvester Grimo's face. His eyes widened in horror, and his mouth slowly opened to shout, "No!" But it was too late. The coin fell, and with a loud hiss, it sank into the boiling liquid. The liquid, which had been bubbling steadily, suddenly began to churn violently, changing colors: red, green, purple. It seemed that something inside the cauldron was displeased with this intrusion. I understood why it happened. This was the plan we had devised with Marcus. We had decided to swap the coin and spent days crafting a perfect replica. Time had been tight, but we succeeded. Marcus had deliberately worn the replica in plain sight, while hiding the real coin in his clothing, inside his sock. And now, the fake coin had been thrown into the cauldron instead of the real one. Sylvester Grimo shot me a furious look. He wanted to say something, but didn't get the chance. The liquid in the cauldron began to bubble even more violently. Everyone around froze, anticipating something terrible, though no one knew what would happen next. Then it happened. A sudden explosion rocked the tent, throwing everyone back. Luckily, Ethan and I were far enough from the epicenter that we weren't too badly hurt. A fire broke out around us. I lay on the ground, struggling to regain my senses when I felt someone untying me. It was Ethan. Somehow, he had managed to free himself and was now untying me. That guy was as reliable as ever. As soon as I could stand, we started running for the exit. But suddenly, a scream rang out behind us. It was Sylvester Grimo, bloodied and crazed, standing amidst the flames. His face was twisted in rage and pain, and he was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words. Everything was drowned out by the sounds of the blazing tent. I raised my revolver, aimed, and shot him straight in the head. I didn't know what became of him after that, but it didn't matter anymore. We had to escape. The air around us became noticeably heavier. The flames continued to hungrily devour the fabric of the tent, and I could hear the beams cracking under the pressure of the fire. The tent was about to collapse. But suddenly, right in front of us, with a deafening roar, stood a huge man, the very giant with monstrous hands. His eyes burned with wild fury, and it seemed he had no intention of letting us go so easily. Ethan screamed, stopping abruptly, but I didn't hesitate and pulled out my revolver and fired. The bullet hit the giant in the shoulder, but he only swayed slightly, like a mountain peak bending in the wind. The dull blow of his fist was quick and deadly, missing me by a hair's breadth and knocking the revolver out of my hand. The weapon hit the ground with a thud and disappeared into the shadows. I could feel the ground trembling under his steps as he moved toward us. "Run, Ethan!" I shouted, though I knew our chances were slim. We wouldn't get out of here alive unless... My gaze fell on the ropes that held up the tent. A massive support beam, holding the tent's canopy, stood right above us. It was risky, but we had no other choice. Without thinking, Ethan rushed to the rope and with desperate force yanked it down. I saw the rope strain and then heard a loud crack. The tent's support beam wobbled, and just seconds before the giant could strike again, the entire structure collapsed right on top of him. The massive wooden beam crashed down, pinning him, and finally, I heard his cry of pain, drowned out by the crackling of the burning tent. "Let's go!" Ethan yelled. But by now the fire had surrounded us on all sides. We desperately pushed through the thick cloud of smoke, each breath burning our lungs, and ahead of us was only a narrow strip of open space between the walls of fire. I could feel my shirt smoldering, the flames licking at my heels as we summoned the last of our strength and ran toward the exit. And then, just at the edge of the tent, a shadow blocked our path. It was the werewolf girl. She looked at me with a strange expression, but it wasn't anger or rage. In her eyes there was a deep sadness, or perhaps even a sense of release. Then she simply stepped aside, letting us pass. I didn't know why she did it. Maybe she had been a prisoner of that dark force, and now, as everything crumbled, she had found freedom. We ran without looking back. The fire quickly engulfed the tent, and soon everything was ablaze. People began to gather, watching the spectacle of the burning performance. I didn't know what had happened to the other members of the circus, but considering the scale of the fire, I doubted anyone had survived. When the fire had fully consumed the tent, the police arrived. I told them what had happened, though I left out some of the more bizarre details to avoid raising too many questions. After the fire had been put out, the police searched the remains. They found only one skeleton, a skeleton with a bullet hole in the head. I immediately knew it was Sylvester Grimo. The rest of the circus members had simply vanished, as if they had evaporated. Later, when I tried to find out what had happened to those who had lost their abilities due to the coins, I learned that their skills had returned, but they were as they had been before acquiring the coins. Now they were just ordinary people, no longer possessing any supernatural gifts.